We welcome you back to the Big Bid Theory, and before we get started, our thoughts and prayers go out to the people of Manchester, a city I lived in England for a few years, some of you may be aware, and Manchester, a city which I've had the good fortune to visit, truly inspiring. I think we'll all agree, the strength and resolve on display. I'm Bill Culhane, the host of TBBT, coming to you actually from the road over here in Georgia. I'm taking part in an event here in the Peach State. If you're returning to the show, we thank you and welcome back. If you're new to our little show, here's what we strive to accomplish. If governments research, request, and or purchase it, we discuss it. As a matter of fact, we monitor the latest tally shows well over 110,000 public sector websites. We invite a variety of guests onto the show. Again, I'm proud to note we have absolutely hit a home run on the guest for this episode. You've heard the talk about U.S. infrastructure. Turn on the television, turn on the radio, look at the various podcasts out there. Who better to hear from than a gentleman who has been and continues to be in ground zero of infrastructure research, analysis, and debate. Our visit with Greg DiLoreto is coming up. By the way, thank you very much to our new friend Becky Mullen from ASCE for helping to coordinate this visit. A little bit about Greg. He was the 2013 president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. He has testified before Congress on issues related to infrastructure, has traveled around the world, engaged in all matters infrastructure. Greg has been in the trenches, having recently served as the CEO of a water district. You'll hear him talk more about that in a moment. Remember back in school, what would a grade of D plus have meant to you? What if your kids came walking through the door with a D plus on their report cards? Well, such a grade on the U.S. infrastructure has me asking questions. What about you? Mr. Greg DiLoreto fills in some blanks.
Mr. DiLoreto, we very much appreciate you joining the show and sharing your insight on what's going on currently as it pertains to U.S. infrastructure.
Well, thank you for having me on the show today, Bill.
Absolutely. Now, let's get started. The American Society of Civil Engineers recently released its 2017 Infrastructure Report Card. For everyone, by the way, there's a link to the report in the description of this episode, and as I've looked it over, sobering information. I implore everyone listening, go review the report, understand what it means. As a matter of fact, I'll just share this. If you go to the report, you'll be able to also pick up and look at some specific data on your state, where you live, where you work. So, Greg, we have listeners from literally every corner of this country. Please give us a summation. What do the findings in the ASCE report reveal?
Well, they reveal some pretty sobering news. We have a 20th century infrastructure. We're paying for it with 20th century revenue sources, and yet we live in the 21st century. Our report card shows that America's infrastructure overall, across 16 individual categories of infrastructure, gets a grade of D+. That's unfortunately the same grade that report card, the infrastructure received in our 2013 report card overall for America's infrastructure. We cover these 16 categories, which include roads and bridges and water and electric grid, airports, and so forth. And each of those, of course, gets an individual grade. And just like your old report card where you had a grade in math and a grade in English and a grade in science, we're able to take all those individual grades and we come up with that D+ for America's infrastructure.
Yeah, not very good. I don't profess by any stretch of the imagination to be an expert. That being said, in the past 24 months here, we've reported on, and you've already touched on some of them, we've reported on energy, bridges, dams, water treatment, transportation, education, airports, a myriad of industries is what I'm getting at. So we kind of have an understanding there are a number of government entities active and investing in addressing deficiencies, some better than others, obviously, D+. So that being said, Greg, along with an obvious funding. And by the way, I saw one estimate of a $2 trillion shortfall. So as I look at the ASCE report, our nation's infrastructure problems are solvable if we have leadership and commit to making good ideas a reality. In your opinion, Greg, what are a few good ideas to address this D-plus grade?
Well, clearly, I want to hit on a couple of them, and certainly funding is the biggest one. If you look at our report card,
sure,
that's the number one recommendation, the $2 trillion shortfall, as you mentioned. Now, the fact of the matter is some of our 16 categories did a little better than others, but clearly each one needs additional funding. But they also need some other things that happen. With the funding then goes along with us doing innovative things, and in fact, our report card grades each of these categories. Part of the makes up the grade. One of the criteria is innovation, and we're seeing that in all 16 categories. So engineers out there that are designing and building, maintaining, and operating these systems are trying to be innovative with the money that they get, and things such as new materials, new methods of construction, for example, are just a couple of the ways. Computer programs, for example, in the water industry, asset management, which is a computer program that utilities can use that helps them be predictive in when water lines need to be replaced, as opposed to just waiting until we have 5 breaks on a particular line. I think it's time to replace it. When you start using some of those new tools to make that funding go further.
Precisely, and we see across our desk, we see a number of requests, as I touched upon, that there are public sector entities that are trying to make inroads. The next topic, the next subject, to be frank, it makes some people uncomfortable, and I understand that. I spent a number of years abroad. A close friend of mine worked for years in the Middle East, and our listeners to the show will remember we had a guest on, Dr. Colin Clark. I'm not sure if you're aware of Dr. Clark, Greg, but he's a RAND Corporation and Carnegie Mellon professor, a noted expert on global terrorism. And we understand that there are people intending to do harm, to include targeting our U.S. infrastructure. So in your opinion, what are some important security considerations as it pertains to taking care of, managing, protecting our infrastructure?
Right. Well, clearly most of us, those of us that were in the utility industry, and I should say that I spent 14 years as the chief executive for a water utility, we certainly have turned around the way that we approach our utilities, particularly after the attacks of 9/11. Before that, our facilities were rather open, and they were quite visible to anyone that wanted to see them. Since that time, they are becoming less visible, less noticed, and, we're seeing a hardening of many of those facilities as a result of, certainly the result of the 9/11 attacks. And so, most of our, certainly in the water industry, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, those industries have certainly gone some way to hardening those facilities so that we can at least prevent an attack.
Yeah, well, we've seen that as well. And now, Greg, it's what I consider a fun portion of the segment. I kind of call it the crystal ball portion of the segment. As you look down the road, if you and I were to get back on this call 5 to 10 years down the road, where do you predict U.S. infrastructure will be in 2022, 2027?
Well, Bill, I want to be optimistic. We've produced
Me too.
We've produced the report. We've been producing it since 1998, every 4 years. We've heard people ran for office this last November. Both presidential candidates ran on a platform of funding infrastructure. Many people ran for Congress on a platform of funding infrastructure. State and local leaders ran on platforms of funding infrastructure. Of course, we're certainly suggesting it's time then to maintain those campaign promises. And if they can, then certainly we see in the next 10 years that our infrastructure would get to a grade of B, which is what the American Society of Civil Engineers recommends. That's a good condition. And if we can do that, we can avoid hits on our economy to the tune of $3.9 trillion in gross domestic product that we will lose if we don't get it to a grade of B. That's the equivalent GDP of Germany today. We'll also see businesses that can save $7 trillion in business sales because we have a fully functioning economy. And we can avoid a loss of 2.5 million jobs in the year 2025 alone because we've invested in our infrastructure and we have gotten that grade of B. So we've maintained our economic prosperity. But really the number I always like to focus on is we have determined that if we fail to do this, if in 10 years you and I are talking and we fail to do it, we're seeing a loss to each American family of $3,400 a year in disposable income because they're having to spend it on car repairs, alternatives to the infrastructure they have, or wasted time and wasted gas. That's $9 a day. Closing that $2 trillion gap would only cost each American family $3 a day. So you can do the math, and you can see it's an incredible return on investment to spend $3 a day to avoid a $9 a day hit for stuff we don't want to do.
Yeah, I wasn't a math major, but I've got my calculator sitting here, and that makes perfect sense, CENTS. There's no doubt about that. Mr. DiLoreto, again, I'm incapable of fully expressing how appreciative we are of your time. I know our listeners have gained some invaluable insight. And by the way, appreciate the work that ASCE is doing as well. All the best to you, and hopefully down the road we can bring you back on, and there will likely be some better news to report. At least that's my hope.
Well, and that's my hope too. You know, people take our infrastructure for granted, and yet it affects us every single day of our lives. It's the one thing that our public sector provides us that every single one of us uses and can make our life so much better if it's working properly. There's no doubt. I actually flew from Austin. I'm out in Georgia. Flew into Atlanta last night. I've got an engagement here this week. And as I was preparing for the event, I had the TV on in the background and just in channel surfing around with no intention of, hey, let me track down discussion about infrastructure. 3 times during various news programs, I heard discussion about infrastructure. So it clearly is a part of the dialogue. Yes, it is. Absolutely. We're hearing it all over the country. We're seeing states take many matters in their own hands and raising gas taxes, for example, utilities raising their rates. We're seeing people think about it. Now, we believe this report card has helped serve as an educational tool to help people understand the critical importance infrastructure plays. I predict it has, and it will. So, again, Greg, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for having me on the program.
Again, that was Greg DiLoreto. You don't have hours to cull the internet and learn about U.S. infrastructure. Look over the ASCE report card. In addition, you can go to bidprime.com to see what infrastructure-related requests are in the pipeline. D plus $2 trillion. That's a lot to digest, and in short, the U.S. better get cracking. That's going to do it for this episode. I want to thank you so much for taking a moment, taking a second to download, share, and follow the Big Bid Theory. You can send your emails to me at bculhane@bidprime.com. You can hit Jim Ward's inbox at jward@bidprime.com. The show's Twitter is @TheBigBidTheory. My personal Twitter is contract_hunter. Jim is Jim Ward, the number 6. Remember, we're also on Facebook if you want to check out some of the things that we post over there. Next time, it's special edition time. In a couple of weeks, we'll have another highly respected, a global expert, in this case on mixed reality and more. Until that next show, for our amazing staff, hoping I bring back bags of boiled peanuts and peaches from Georgia, and crossing their fingers that we figure out this huge infrastructure problem. Until that next time, friends, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
So much fun. So much fun. Crazy. We're having so much fun. So much fun.